Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've got an interesting device today. It's the AYANEO Pocket DMG. Now, at face value, this looks like a big old Game Boy, but it's actually one of the more powerful Android-based handhelds that we have on the market. And so I kind of like the mismatch of this thing. It's got an old classic look to it. It even has a volume wheel on it, like back in the day. And so there is a bit of a magical quality to the AYANEO Pocket DMG. It looks and feels like a really premium Game Boy, but it also has enough power to be able to play modern Android games, as well as up to like PS2. But like with all the good things in life, it's just not that simple. It has some hardware and software flaws, and the asking price is pretty steep. So in this video, I want to capture all the ins and outs of the Pocket DMG to see whether or not it would be worth getting as a super premium Game Boy for you. And so without any further delay, grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we should start by talking about the price because this is going to color the entire review. And the AYANEO Pocket DMG is definitely on the high end when it comes to these Android-based handhelds. We're still within the early bird pricing for many of these models, and so the very cheapest that you can find this device right now is about $340. Bear in mind that that will only come with 8 GB of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. And the price will climb up from there depending on the amount of RAM and storage that you're really looking for. And they also have a limited edition retro color, which is the one they sent me, and this one starts at $589. For me personally, if I was to pick one of these up, I would probably go with the 12 GB model, so we're looking at somewhere between $420 to $529 depending on when you buy it. And so yes, this is an expensive handheld, and it makes it somewhat hard to recommend just because the price point is so high. It is a big investment. And so this review video is going to be quite long because I want to make sure that I cover every single thing that you might be looking for. And I think there's a distinction here between being expensive and being overpriced, and I do not think that this is an overpriced handheld. The chip and the screen and the overall quality of it does feel like it costs this much money, and so it's not something that feels like a ripoff to me. But it does limit the potential customer base just because it is so expensive. You know, you can buy a handheld that kind of looks like this for around $60 or $70 from like Ambernick. But as I'll demonstrate throughout this video, I think that the overall experience is going to be night and day between the two. So let's go ahead and jump in and start talking about the specs and what you will actually get for this high price. We'll start with the CPU, which is the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2. This is considered Qualcomm's gaming-centered chip, and it's essentially the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but with some gaming-centric tweaks. And honestly, it's pretty hard to tell what those differences are because Qualcomm is pretty opaque about just saying their stats. But at the very least, I can say that the benchmark scores are similar between something like the Odin 2 with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and then this one here with the G3X Gen 2. Now in terms of RAM, it is LPDDR5X, and we've got a few different options depending on the model that you buy. Same thing with storage. It's going to be UFS 4.0 for all of them except for the 128 gig model. That's going to be 3.1. Either way, yes, you have a variety of different RAM and storage specs to meet your needs. Now, one of the big draws for me is this display. It is just shy of 4 inches, and it is a 1240 by 1080 resolution. And the aspect ratio on this is nearly 8 by 7, so very close to the native or square pixels for the Super Nintendo. Now, this resolution and aspect ratio does not scale natively with basically any system on the market, but it actually does a pretty good job with all of them, and we'll demonstrate that in this video. And of note, this is an OLED panel, and it does get up to 500 nits of brightness. Now, the battery on this is pretty hefty. We'll talk about battery life near the end of the video, but it is 6,000 milliamp hours. It is also capable of 25 watt power delivery, so it does charge pretty quickly. It is also fairly lightweight for its size. It's about 273 grams, which makes it about 50 grams lighter than the original Game Boy DMG. In terms of connectivity, this chipset is rated for Wi-Fi 7 as well as Bluetooth 5.3. And it is an Android-based handheld. It's running Android 13. Finally, we do have a couple other bells and whistles, including a new Hall sensor analog stick as well as a trackpad. Now let's jump into the unboxing, and this was a review unit sent over from AYANEO. And like with all my videos, they're not going to see this ahead of time, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. Now I've always really liked the packaging of AYANEO products, and I think this one is no different. It's got a nice retro vibe to it. And inside, we've basically just got the AYANEO Pocket DMG, and it's really well packaged. Further down, we've got a couple accessories, including some documentation, again, really nicely packaged, and they also have some spare shoulder buttons in case you want to change them out. And these buttons are actually a different color. It's going to depend on the device that you buy, but you can see here that, yeah, you could swap swap them out for a metallic finish instead. And then finally, we've got a pretty high quality USB-C charging cable. Now, first impressions of the AYANEO DMG is really impressive. In fact, this device is rather stunning. Now, I've often felt that AYANEO is very good when it comes to marketing. They make these beautiful graphics and renders, but often when I get a device in the hands, it's not quite as impressive as I was led to believe. And it's surprising, but the AYANEO DMG is an opposite effect. This is one that I picked up and immediately thought to myself, holy smokes, not only is this probably one of the most refined handhelds I've ever seen from them, I think it's probably just the best thing that AYANEO has ever made. And so yes, the overall look and feel of the AYANEO DMG is incredible. It is basically just a souped up modern version of an original Game Boy. Now part of this has to do with the fact that I do have that DMG model with this gray border around it, and so it's very evocative of that original Game Boy, but even then I bet you that the white and even the black models are very impressive. And part of it has to do with the plastic texture here. It has a beautiful powdery finish. This device never gets hot either, which is kind of crazy. And then also it's just super rounded on the side, just almost at a perfect angle. And so just putting my fingers across it and holding it in the hands is really impressive. It's also super well balanced. This is just a very beautiful device to hold. I also think the buttons and everything else are positioned really well. You know, I don't get the analog stick in my way at all. It is just a really nice experience. If we compare it to the original Game Boy DMG, you can see that they're of a similar size and honestly a pretty similar weight as well, but it's just a night and day difference in terms of quality and just premium feel. It's also quite a bit thinner and sleeker than the DMG, and I think that just kind of goes a long way as well. To put it another way, I think that it is like an upscaled version of the Analog Pocket. Now this has always felt like a premium handheld. I love the cornering and everything else on that, but this one just feels like they took it and elevated it a little bit more. And I think a lot of it has to do with these controls, which again, I think are maybe some of the best that AYANEO has ever made. Let's start with the D-pad, and first thing here is that it's actually very big, probably one of the biggest that I've seen on a modern retro handheld. This has a rubber membrane connection, much like, a classic controller, and it is rather shallow, and so it does not have a ton of travel to it, but it's still very satisfying to press down on. And it has just the right amount of tactile feedback. You can feel it bouncing right up, and it's super satisfying. So not too hard, not too soft, it is just right. Now, when it comes to in-game performance, it's about what I would want with a D-pad. When doing the contour test, which is where I press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right, I can make the character move, but it does take a little bit of force to actually get there. If I just wobble it slightly, the character won't actually move, and this is about where I want it to be. This means that when I want to press a diagonal, I can, but the false diagonals are pretty rare. So when it comes to a precision platformer like this, I think that it does pass it with flying colors. Now, the other side of the spectrum is a Street Fighter test. So here with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, what I'm checking here is whether or not it's Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. And by that, I'm checking to see whether or not it's easy to press these quarter circle moves. And yeah, it actually works really well. Like with all D-pads, it does take a period of adjustment, and it is a little bit flatter than I would like in terms of travel, but I think that just in general, it works really well. So my only complaint here is that it is a little bit shallow when it comes to travel, but overall I think it is an excellent D-pad, and again, one of the best I've seen from AYANEO. I would give it like an 8, maybe an 8.5 out of 10. Now on the other side we have our face buttons, and these are also very unique. I've never seen something like this from AYANEO. Number one, they are quite shallow and have the same amount of travel as the D-pad, but they are nice and rounded. They have a nice pill shape to them. This is something that AYANEO has struggled with over the years. And so I like the overall feel of these. They don't get to the point where they bottom out or anything, but they are rather close to the shell, but still very satisfying. And I love the amount of feedback and bounce that we have here. To put it another way, these are very easy buttons to press down on, and I feel like I could press them thousands of times. I could play this for hours on end and not have any fatigue. And given the overall design layout and everything else and where your thumbs are positioned, it is super comfortable to hold this device. And so I think they really just nailed these controls when it comes to the basics, which are the D-pad and face buttons. Now there are other things going on with this handheld, so let's talk about the rest. So let's start with this one analog stick. Now finally, AYANEO has fixed this analog stick. It is a full Hall sensor and is not one of those Switch knockoffs. So the range of motion here is quite a bit more than other handhelds that you will find with smaller joysticks from AYANEO. In fact, this feels ultra smooth and precise. I also like that they put a nice slick casing around the stick itself, so it has a very smooth feel as you move it around. The stick itself has just enough grippiness to it as well to make it just a really satisfying experience, and so I really like this stick. Again, probably one of the best that AYANEO has made in this smaller stick space. Now the other unique thing about this one is that on this right side right here, it's actually a trackpad, and this basically mimics your right analog stick. It actually clicks down for R3 as well. Now this trackpad has two different modes. By default, it's going to be in a right analog stick mode, so it's just going to mimic a right analog stick, but you can also turn it into a mouse cursor if you would like. Now personally, I don't think a mouse cursor is going to be critical when it comes to an Android-based handheld, just because it is touch-friendly. So I have been just keeping it on the default right analog stick mode. Now when using a gamepad tester app and using it with the right analog stick mode, it actually has a really nice range of motion. It has a circular input, but you can see that I can go basically anywhere I want, and it feels very precise. In fact, in comparison to the left analog stick, which again has a really nice range of motion, this one actually feels like I have a little bit less precision compared to the trackpad. Now these inputs are all fine and dandy when it comes to a gamepad testing app, but it really comes down to what it's like to game with something like this. And the honest truth is that using a right trackpad when playing a game that's made to be used with an analog stick does feel a little bit off. And I found that two types of games will really highlight this overall experience. If we're talking about a left analog stick centric game, one of those where you just basically use the right analog stick to reposition the camera, I think it's just fine. It's not quite as precise and fluid as using a right analog stick where you just kind of flick it to exactly where you want it to be, but it still gets the job done. And so games like this, where you use the left analog stick the most and then reposition the camera, I think it's fully playable. However, when it comes to dual stick games, these are games that are, mostly going to be shooters and things like that, this is a miserable experience for me. And that's because with a trackpad, you don't have the same type of feedback as an analog stick when you know that you're going to 50 or 100%. Instead, you have to just guess with your thumb with no cues whatsoever. And so I often find myself steering too much or not enough. And so when it comes to playing a shooter game where I'm trying to aim with that right analog trackpad, it just does not work for me. And I tested this on a bunch of different platforms, different types of games, but basically any dual stick game like this was just a miserable experience for me. It was just awful. And so that's my first word of caution about the AYANEO DMG. It really funnels you into a specific gameplay experience just based on that right trackpad. And we'll talk a little bit more about this controller experience when we get into actual gameplay testing so I can show you more demos. Now also up front, we've got our select and start buttons. These are relatively flat to the device itself, so they're a little bit shallow, but I love the little touches, like this little bit of engraving right here just to make it pop a little bit more. And then finally on the bottom, we've got our AYANEO button, and this will bring up the AYANEO quick menu to make quick adjustments. We will test this out more when we talk about the software experience. And this does have RGB lighting. You can customize the color, or you can also just turn it off like I've been doing most of the time. Let's take a look at the sides. So these have side speakers. This is the left one right here. Then we have two different function buttons. By default, this one that's called LC will bring up your recent items. And so you can press that and then kind of swipe through if you would like. And this button right here, I'm not really sure what it does. This has always been a problem with their Android software, is that sometimes these buttons just don't make any sense. For example, here in the PSP emulator, I can push this button and it does nothing. And so I'm not really sure what it's supposed to be doing right now. It's not back, it's not home. Who knows? Now further down, we've got a volume wheel, and this is really cool. It's got a nice kind of tactile feedback as you roll it up and down. And you can also push it down to do a quick mute as well. And so it's been really fun to change out the volume with a wheel like this. It just has a nice classic kind of retro vibe. And then finally on the bottom here on the left, we've got a toggle switch, and this will switch between the different performance modes. And so you can toggle between them to go from the power saving mode to the normal mode, all the way up to the max mode. And so depending on the game that you're playing, you can kind of toggle it through to get a little bit better performance at the expense of battery life. Now on the right side, we've got our right stereo speaker and then two more of these mysterious buttons. And again, I'm not really sure what these do because they do the exact same thing, which is essentially a home button. So it's just going to bring you back to your main home page. And so this is something that's always been a criticism of mine about Android-based devices from AYANEO. They've got all these function buttons. It's really cool that we have all these options, but there's nothing in the software to let you actually program them. And so we're just basically left with these function buttons that are really confusing. And so I end up instead spending more time swiping because I know what a back is. I know what swiping up will do, but I'm not sure what these buttons will do at any given time. And so as a result, I just don't use these buttons at all. And it is definitely a missed opportunity because this is such a nice design. You would want everything to work in the software as well. Further down, we've got our power and sleep button, and this also is a fingerprint sensor, so you can unlock your device by pressing your finger right here. And then finally at the bottom here, we've got a micro SD card slot, so you can put that in here. Now the one that they sent me is a 1 terabyte internal storage, and so I did not use a micro SD card. Everything is saved internally on the device. Now looking at the bottom, we've got a USB-C port. This can do 25 watt PD charging and also is capable of video out. And we will test that in the gameplay section of this video as well. well. Now the main thing on the back here is our air intake and then the exhaust up here on top, and then we've got our shoulder and trigger buttons. Now these are pretty interesting. Our shoulder buttons have a nice soft click to them, but then the trigger buttons are also clicky and not analog, they're digital only, and they're embedded here within the shoulder, so it almost looks like there are no buttons here, but they are there. You can click on either side. And this can become a problem depending on the game that you're playing. For example, if you're playing a racing game where you want to have an analog trigger, this is just a digital input, so you're just going to floor it every time. And so this, much like with the trackpad, is kind of a mismatch between the modern games that can play on this, but the control scheme in particular, which just doesn't match it correctly. Now let's talk about ergonomics and what it's like to actually hold and play this device. And it is obviously a vertical handheld and all those things that come with that. So when it comes to just the front portion here, just kind of reaching the buttons, yes, the D-pad and the face buttons are easy to reach. The analog stick is a little bit more of a reach. This is a little bit less comfortable, but because it's a vertical handheld, you can just shift your hand down and then you can hold it like this. And it's a little bit mismatched, kind of holding your hands like this, but overall, this is a lot more comfortable of an experience. And in general, just the experience of holding this device, nice and flat here on the front, but then nice and curved in all the other spots. It is very comfortable. Now on the back, it is a little bit cramped. This is a vertical handheld, so it's not going to have a full space for your hands to kind of flex out across it. Instead, you'll kind of have to do a weave with your fingers just to be able to hold it a little bit more comfortably. And again, this is no different than any other vertical handheld. It's just kind of the overall control scheme. So I've always found these to be a little bit less comfortable than a horizontal handheld, but when it comes to a vertical handheld, I do find this nice and comfortable. The shoulder and trigger buttons do act as a nice shelf for your index fingers, which allow you to balance everything nicely. And in general, I usually will spread my pinkies down to below the device. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I like the fact that I can kind of spread my hands out all the way. It allows me to play this for hours on end. And it is a relatively lightweight handheld, all things considered, given the fact that it is pretty large. It's 273 grams altogether. And it's actually the exact same weight as the Analog Pocket. And like I mentioned, it's about 50 grams lighter than the Game Boy DMG with a cartridge and batteries installed. Now let's do a couple quick size comparisons so you get an idea of just how big or small this is. It is slightly larger than the Analog Pocket, but really not by much. It's also a little bit wider than the Game Boy DMG, but maybe half the overall thickness. And finally, it's also a little bit taller and skinnier than the Anbernic RG406V, which up until today was probably the most powerful vertical Android-based handheld that I had at my disposal. And the difference in look and feel between these two really highlights the premium feel of the AYANEO and the more toy-like and kind of bulbous feeling of the Anbernic. And between the two, I think the AYANEO DMG is what I would prefer to play. Like, it's just so nice and elegant compared to something like this, which is a little bit more rudimentary by comparison. Okay, now let's talk about the screen. This is an OLED display, and I think it is very beautiful. Now to start, you might see a little bit of like a flowing line across the edges of the screen like this. This is just a result of an OLED display, and it's not visible to the naked eye. And in general, when it comes to the colors and the saturation and the overall brightness and darkness, I think it is a really excellent panel. This is about at 50% brightness here. You can see we have some peaks here with the sun, and then the road is a little bit darker. And so from a color perspective, I found this to be just a joy to use. I think it is really nice. Now when it comes to brightness and dimness, I think we have a pretty good range here. For example, now we're at about 50% brightness, but I can go all the way up, and yes, it gets very bright. And so it's definitely brighter than what the camera can handle here in the studio environment. Now outdoors in direct sunlight, like in this footage right here, it's not quite as impressive. This is something that I definitely could play outdoors and definitely in a shaded environment, but in bright sunlight like this, it doesn't quite get to the point where I would find it to be a really enjoyable experience. Instead, I would say that this will work well in most brightly lit environments, but it would only really work in a pinch in direct sunlight. Now, the other end of the spectrum will be in a very dim scenario. So for example, if you wanted to play this late at night and you wanted to make sure that it got as dark as possible. And unfortunately here, it does not get very dim. As you can see, the picture is still very clear even at the lowest brightness. Even when I turn off the studio lights, you can see that it is quite bright, especially compared to other handhelds. And that's kind of a shame for me because one of my favorite ways to play a vertical handheld is in bed, because I feel like I can just kind of lay on my side and then play it like this. And so I've always found vertical handhelds to be well suited for playing in the dark and like in bed. And this has been a little bit too bright in that case. So there have been times when I wanted to lay in bed and, maybe just play a few minutes of a role-playing game, and I found the overall screen to just be a little bit too much. So long story short, when it comes to this screen, I think that it works well in most environments, but in extreme conditions, for example, in broad daylight or in a really dark environment in bed, it just doesn't quite hit those metrics as much as I would like. Okay, next let's do an audio test with Streets of Rage 2 on the Sega Genesis at 100% volume. And honestly, I think that the audio is probably some of the best that I've ever heard from AYANEO. It sounds really good. It does lack a little bit of bass, but it is ultra sharp and clear. And then also, I love the fact that these side speakers give a little bit of a stereo differentiation. And so in addition to being probably the best feeling AYANEO device that I've ever used, it's also the best sounding one as well. Now, speaking of sounds, the other thing worth noting is that the fan noise on this is quite loud. We've got 4 different options. There's saving and balance and game and max. And at saving, you're just not going to hear anything. The fan will be off, and at balance, it'll be lightly on and really mostly inaudible. However, once you get into game and then max, it gets a lot louder than you might expect. In fact, this is to the point where it's distracting for me. So let me give you a listen here of both game and max so you can see what that difference is going to sound like. And so hopefully this came out in the video, but yes, it is a very loud cooling fan, and it gets the job done. In fact, when pushing it to the max, when I did some temperature checks, it's about 35 degrees Celsius max, and so it is definitely cooling the device, but I feel like it's a little bit aggressive. And so if you are someone who's annoyed by fan noise in general, then this might be a little bit over your threshold. Okay, now let's talk about the software experience, and I think this is going to be relatively familiar if you've ever tested out any other AYANEO device. To start, this is an Android-based handheld, which means that, installing apps and emulators and games and whatnot is just going to be a matter of using it like a phone. So you'll go into the Google Play Store, download your stuff, and then install it all. But there are a couple things unique to this Android build from AYANEO. The first will be the AYANEO quick menu. So here you can check out stuff like, the frames per second, as well as the overall utilization of the components. You can also toggle between the different performance modes, which is the same thing as just using this physical click button. You can also make manual adjustments to the fan, and then in the next section we have the ability to change things like the overall vibration, as well as the analog sticks. By default, I would say most of these settings are going to be fine, but you can fine tune them. But I will say that I would love to have the ability to be able to customize these RC and LC buttons here within the menu, but unfortunately, that's just not a thing. Further down, we've got our handheld settings. You can adjust things like brightness or turn on the RGB lighting. We've also got a bunch of widgets right here, which is very similar to the stuff that you can get from swiping down from the top menu anyway. And then finally, we have the ability to jump into the AYANEO settings. And so let's go into that next. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to be very similar to what we can do in the quick menu with a couple differences. For example, in the performance menu, yes, we have our 4 different options, but we can also toggle in different things as well. So here you can adjust things like the GPU and CPU limit, as well as the CPU scheduler, and then you can also fine tune the fan. So if you wanted, you could set it to max and then low fan, and so that way you're going to get really high performance but a lower fan noise, which might be a little bit better, but obviously will make the device run hotter. And so this might be a good solution if you are trying to get good performance without having that fan blasting at you. You can kind of fiddle around with this and see if you can get something better. Now, the controller settings does have a couple fine-tuned things. So for example, we can go to the lighting effect. We can change out the RGB light to a separate color or different brightness. All that's affected here. You can also recalibrate your controller, and then this custom button thing might make you think that, oh, you can customize these buttons, but no, it's the ability to be able to change out your ABXY, and you can swap out your L2 and R2. But again, this would be the perfect place to have button customizations for these ones. Now in the device settings, we do have some power user settings. You could run a root script, or you could also do device spoofing. So if you wanted it to behave like a Samsung Galaxy, you can set all this up. You can also physically adjust the fan algorithm for each setting. So you've got a lot of customization here. And finally, the other major thing that you will probably spend a lot of time in is the update section, because they've been pushing out updates like once a week. I've only had this thing for about 2 weeks, and I've seen like 3 different updates come across. So I do appreciate the fact that they are continuing to work on this Android build, although it does feel a little bit janky. And again, not a lot of it has to do with the actual software itself. Getting in and out of your games, treating this like an Android device is relatively easy. And I do like the fact that I can just jump into here, change out my performance profiles really quickly. But I will say that for the most part, I don't really need this physical button and the overlay and all the overhead that comes with it. If we've just got a single toggle here that'll go between the performance profiles, then I don't really need to be able to bring up a quick menu at the same time. And I also feel like a lot of these settings could just be hidden in the top-down menu here instead. That's just going to be embedded into the Android system, much like how they do it with like the Odin and the Retroid devices. And so really what it comes down to is I don't have much complaints about the software other than just the overall software experience, in particular when it comes to these buttons and the fact that they're not customizable and it's not very clear what they are actually supposed to do. And for a device that feels almost obsessive in the little details, it does feel a little bit odd that the software does not match it. Okay, before we jump into performance testing, let's talk a little bit about benchmarks. Now, I don't like to put a lot of stock into these, but they do help to paint the picture. And let's start by comparing the Anbernic RG406V, which again was probably the most powerful Android-based vertical handheld that I had up until this one. And you can see that the Wildlife Extreme test score here from 3D Mark is about 569 with the Anbernic. This is a device that can play most PS2 and GameCube games, but will fall short when it comes to those higher-end systems. Meanwhile, the AYANEO has a much more impressive score, 3,796. But of note, you can see that the lowest loop score, these are 1-minute loops 20 times over, you can see that it dropped down quite a bit, about 1,000 points. And so the rating for stability on this particular handheld is relatively low, about 75%. And if we look at the loop scores, you can see that yes, the first one is very high, and then after that it goes down quite a bit, and then stabilizes around 3,000. And so this does feel like a device that will be very impressive in that first minute, and then it'll start to throttle down. And this is in max mode with the max fan. And if we look at the stats here, like I mentioned, it gets really cool, like 36 degrees max when running it at full tilt. Now, when things get interesting is when we compare the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 over to the AYANEO. And like I mentioned before, these have almost identical benchmark scores. You can see 3761 here with the Odin 2 Portal, and then 3796 with the AYANEO. But the thing about the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and these Odin devices in particular is that they are super stable, 99.8% stability compared to 75.6. And so this one does not dip down when it comes to performance over time. It just kind of stays steady the whole time. And what this means is that by the time you get to like minute 2 or minute 3, there will be a big performance difference, at least when it comes to pushing it to the max between these two devices. But the thing to bear in mind is these are very high-end Android devices. And so even though, yes, there is kind of a bit of a difference when it comes to stability between these two platforms, that may not matter in the context of the games that you're actually going to be playing. So now let's do a dive into the overall gameplay experience of using the AYANEO Pocket DMG, because there are some moments when it is brilliant, like some of the best that I've ever seen on any handheld, but it also has some pretty low lows, and so it's worth talking about both sides. Now to start, when it comes to the navigation experience, I just use Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my front end. I'm using a special skin right here which shows all the various motherboards for each system, and I think it just goes really well with the retro vibe of this device. So let's start with the easiest to run systems and kind of work our way up from there. We'll start with the original Game Boy, and I've made quite a few tweaks right here. Number one, the first thing to bear in mind is that the Game Boy is a 10:9 aspect ratio system, but this screen is 8:7. Now those aspect ratios are very similar, but 10:9 is a little bit more narrow. And rather than have black bars on the left and right, I've just kind of done the unthinkable, and I've just scaled this to 8:7 instead. And so it is going to squish the image a little bit to fit the full 8:7 screen, but I think it just looks a lot more satisfying. Also bear in mind, this is not a true integer scale. It's about 7.5x scale, so a little bit more than a 7x integer scale. And so I am using non-integer scaling here just to blow out the whole screen. And so this is how I've been playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color, using an 8:7 aspect ratio. Even though it is not 10:9, I think it still looks really good. And even though it is not integer scaling, I still think it looks sharp and clear. In a perfect world, we'd be able to use an interpolation shader to be able to perfectly balance the pixels, and then we could use a grid overlay that's specifically made for this resolution. Unfortunately, we don't have any community overlays just yet, but I bet something will pop up over time, which will allow us to get a really nice pixelated experience. But in the meantime, I think that this looks amazing, and so I've really enjoyed this experience, even if it is not pixel perfect. Now, another system that looks really good is going to be the Sega Game Gear. This one has a similar aspect ratio of somewhere between 10:9 and 4:3, depending on who you're asking, but I think 8:7 is a good middle ground. And so again, same settings here as the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and I think the Game Gear looks really nice. It's also a similar story with the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Now this one's aspect ratio was closer to square than 10:9, but again, I still think that 8:7 looks really good. In this case, I would just rather fill up the whole screen, have it just seamlessly work into the bezel, and I think it is just a good experience. It's not perfect, it's not 100% authentic, but it's still just a really elevated experience, all things considered. Now, one system that you can get away with when it comes to integer scaling is Game Boy Advance. This one is a 5.2x scale, so very close to a 5x integer scale. And most of the time when playing a game, there are going to be some black bars on the left and right, but it is very hard to notice. Depending on the game, and if you zoom in really close, yes, you can see them on the left and right, but this is minimal enough for me to just forgive the fact and to just use it with integer scaling. And so I have found that Game Boy Advance is a really excellent experience on here. You will have black bars at the top and bottom because this is a 3:2 aspect ratio system, but I still think that it looks really sharp and clear. It reminds me a lot of playing Game Boy Advance games on the Analog Pocket, which also is nice and crisp. Now, even though the handheld systems are somewhat imperfect, I found that the home console systems give me a better experience, although I do make some compromises. We'll start with NES. So here I'm playing this at a true 8:7 aspect ratio. And one of the things that works really well with this and other systems is that you can turn on integer scaling and then use integer scale over scale. This is going to blow it up to the next biggest integer scale and then cut off all of the overscan, which mostly are just going to be pixels that were not really important when it came to playing these games. Now, I personally don't like really playing 4:3 systems at 8:7, especially when it comes to NES, because it is a little bit inauthentic for me, and this is one of my primary systems growing up. But because it fills out the screen so nicely and works really well with shaders like this scanline one, I think it's still a good compromise to make. And so even though 8:7 is not my first choice when it comes to NES, it's something that I've just learned to live with because it is so beautiful on this display. Now, this same kind of setup but on the Super Nintendo is a lot easier for me to stomach. And it's the same thing here, integer scale over scale, so it is going to balance everything out really nicely and then cut off some pixels on the left, right, top, and bottom. And I don't know if it's because I didn't own a Super Nintendo growing up, but playing these at 8:7 is just a little bit easier for me. And this will be square pixels for both the NES and Super Nintendo. It just looks a little bit skinnier, but I still think it looks really nice. And so long story short, this is an amazing experience. The fact that we can have integer scaled Super Nintendo on a device like this on an OLED panel with this high of a resolution is really, really impressive. It's also going to be the same experience with the TurboGrafx 16. I'm going to push this over to an 8:7 aspect ratio. Again, a little bit skinnier than your traditional 4:3 television, but I still think it looks really good. And so all three of these systems, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, TurboGrafx 16, they are just amazing to actually play and see. Now, some systems I just can't compromise on, and one is going to be Sega Genesis. This one just looks too tall if you make it 8:7, but 4:3 is a really good fit for me. And this is also the console I grew up with at the 16-bit era, and so I'm pretty picky about this one. But yes, I don't mind playing 4:3 on this either. It is going to give you minimal black bars at the top and bottom, but I still think it looks very good. It's going to be a similar story with arcade systems because many of these were 4:3, and so yes, you'll get some black bars at the top and bottom, but I still think it looks really good, especially playing these games on an OLED panel. And because it's so powerful, we will be able to play some of the harder to run arcade games no sweat. So something like Killer Instinct, absolutely fine. And because an 8:7 aspect ratio is pretty close to square, playing something like a vertically oriented arcade game still looks really good. We will get some black bars on the left and right, but this is still definitely better than 4:3. And so putting things together, when it comes to playing retro systems, I think the AYANEO Pocket DMG really shines. We've got a lot of room to work with in terms of the aspect ratio and the resolution and integer scaling, and we've got enough overhead to be able to use basically any shader that we want. So now let's kind of graduate from those retro pixel systems and move our way up to the more 3D based games and systems and see how this all plays out as well. Let's start with PlayStation 1. This is a system I chose not to upscale the resolution for. You can totally do that. You can push it all the way up to 1080p. It'll look great, but I just wanted a more retro feeling with a retro looking console. And so here I did keep it with a little bit chunkier pixels, and I thought it looked pretty good. And so this is probably how I would play this system on the AYANEO DMG. Now I also did try some upscaling with other systems, so we'll start with Nintendo 64. My first big takeaway here is that yes, we've got performance power that can go all the way up to 1080p without breaking a sweat. The other thing I noticed starting with Nintendo 64, this is a very analog stick dominant system, and the analog stick on the AYANEO DMG is really, really nice. It has such a smooth smooth and fluid feeling to it, and so playing a game like Cruisin' USA feels very natural. Even games that are more 3D based, like Banjo-Kazooie, which has those camera controls attached to the C buttons, that's now going to be mapped to the trackpad. And so this is one of those games where I do think it is still playable, because you're just going to use those C buttons or the trackpad to just reorient the camera. And so thankfully, even though the trackpad is a little bit awkward, I think that most of these Nintendo 64 games are going to control just fine. Another system that works really well with the AYANEO Pocket DMG is going to be Sega Dreamcast. Here I am also upscaling to a 1080p resolution, and I kept everything at a 4:3 aspect ratio. So we are going to have black bars at the top and bottom, but everything is nice and crisp and upscaled. This is also a system that relied mostly on the D-pad and the left analog stick, and so in general I found this to control really well too. Another system that works really well in the AYANEO DMG is going to be Sega Saturn. This one can use the Beetle core within RetroArch, which is more demanding but more accurate. And of course, performance-wise, this is going to be no problem whatsoever. I'm playing all this at the second setting at this point, which is the balance setting, so we're not even in game mode or anything, so the fan is on, but just barely so. And so I think this is a more than capable Sega Saturn system, to the point where it's just basically effortless. I think it's great. Now let's talk a little bit about handheld systems. We're going to start with Nintendo DS. I did some customizations here. First thing, this is a 4:3 system, but I found that using it at an 8:7 aspect ratio, as in blowing up one single screen to fill up the whole thing, actually still looks really good. It kind of reminds me of playing a Super Nintendo game in 8:7, and so even though this is a bit squarish and tall, I still think it actually controls really well. And when it comes to playing games where you only need to see one screen at a time, like Final Fantasy III, then in general this is going to be a really excellent experience. And because this device is a touchscreen, that means that any touchscreen-centric games like Trauma Center, you'll be able to play this pretty well. You'll have to toggle between the upper and lower screens depending on what's happening in the game, but for the most part, if you can just stick to a single screen experience, then I think Nintendo DS is actually going to look really good. And because this is a relatively tall aspect ratio, you can stack these screens and it'll still look pretty good. So here what I've done with Peggle is I've made the top screen bigger and the bottom screen a little bit smaller, and it is a little bit squinty and small all things considered, but it is still playable. And it's a similar outcome with Nintendo 3DS. Now, performance-wise, this is no problem. I can actually play all these games at a 4x resolution. And because on the 3DS, the upper screen is a little bit wider, that means that you can have them both at about the same size and they're still going to be pretty legible. Again, I wouldn't call this the ideal way to play Nintendo 3DS, but I think it would work in a pinch. Now, one system I didn't find to be super enjoyable is the PlayStation Portable. This one originally was a 16:9 aspect ratio screen. And when playing 16:9 content on an 8:7 screen, it does get quite squinty. And we'll talk about this more in detail when we get to the more advanced systems, because we hit a point where basically everything's going to be 16:9 and less enjoyable as a result. Either way, performance-wise, yes, PSP is great, 1080p upscale with no problem. Again, we're still just playing everything in the balanced mode, and these are all playing without a hitch. Now moving on, let's go into Gen 6, talk about Nintendo GameCube and PS2. And for these, it is relatively set and forget. We have a very powerful processor. So for the most part, I would play these games in balanced mode, and if I was getting a little bit of stuttering at the 3x resolution, which is over 1080p, then I would bump it up into the game mode in terms of the performance settings. And really, that's about it. Sometimes you'll have to toggle between OpenGL and Vulkan backend, but for the most part, you can just play everything with OpenGL, which will be more accurate. There are going to be some high-end games like Rogue Squadron 2, which you will have to put into Vulkan backend to be able to prevent any stuttering. And you might get a stutter here and there, but it'll be pretty few and far between. And so I would say that GameCube is completely playable as long as the emulator has compatibility. It's also going to be a similar story with Nintendo Wii. One thing you have to do is go into the Dolphin settings and turn off the widescreen mode. That'll force all the games that have support for it to play in 4:3. And so that's going to improve the overall experience with the games to play these in 4:3. You may have to pick and choose which games will look the best, but in general, I think that Wii performs just about the same as it does with GameCube. Now moving into PlayStation 2, it's both better and worse in certain regards. One thing that is better about it is that you have fine-tuned scaling settings. So you can set this to a 2.5x resolution upscale, which is going to basically perfectly match this screen. And so that means that we don't have to put it into overdrive by trying to do a 3x upscale, which is more pixels than the screen can handle anyway. And for the most part, this again will be set and forget. So you can just set this up, run it with OpenGL, maybe switch over to Vulkan if it needs it, and then you can just play most of these games. And this is exactly what I expected with this chipset. It's a very similar experience with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 found in the Odin. Now there are a couple things that are a little bit worse than playing with GameCube and Wii. The first is is that the majority of these games will require that game performance mode, which is going to kick in the fan even more. Now you can go into these settings and manually toggle it down. It is going to make the device run a little bit warmer, but it's really going to come down to what you prefer. If you want a cool experience, it's going to be a little bit louder. If you want a quieter experience, it's going to be a little bit warmer. Another thing worth noting is I did encounter some performance problems with certain games that I wasn't expecting. For example, with Dragon Quest VIII, just running it in the regular 2.5x resolution here, I was getting slowdown in certain parts. This particular section of bridge right here in town would bog down quite a bit, down to like 80% sometimes. Now this chip has more than enough power to be able to play this game at a 2.5x resolution, so this is more of a settings tweak or compatibility with the particular chipset. And I found that the best fix for this is to go into the hardware download mode in the graphics settings and disable the readbacks. And if you set this setting, for the most part, this will fix some issues that I found with certain games. And so this exact same setting with Dragon Quest VIII, but with that toggle turned on, it runs just fine. Maybe a hiccup here and there, but still very, very playable. And so this will be the trick for certain games. I found this in particular with Dragon Quest VIII as well as Jak 3, and I also found that it improved performance with God of War 2. So long story short, I do think that PS2 is a fully playable system on this chipset as well, within the limits of the actual Nether SX2 emulator. This app is no longer in active development, which means that what we see right now in terms of performance and emulation compatibility is about what we get. But thankfully, this still means that the vast majority of PS2 games are going to be fully playable on the AYANEO DMG. Now moving on, let's talk about the more modern systems, which are going to be in a 16:9 aspect ratio. So we're just going to briefly touch on these because I think that they are not really the focus of this handheld. If we look at 16:9 content like Sonic Mania on Nintendo Switch here on this screen, you can see that we're only getting about 3.3 inches altogether. So this overall experience is quite small and squinty, and so I have not found this to be very enjoyable. Now from a performance standpoint, it's still going to work out really well. So we have the beta version of Cemu right now, and this works well with most Wii U games already. But I will say that Nintendo Switch performance here is a little bit worse than I was expecting, especially compared to something like the Odin 2. Again, I don't think it has to do with raw performance power, but more likely the fact that this particular Snapdragon chip has not been used on many devices, and so emulation development probably isn't as mature as with the more popular Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It's all kind of moot at this point because Switch emulation is somewhat dead on Android just because Nintendo kind of took them all out. And in any case, I'd never really found this to be that enjoyable because the screen is so small. So it's one of those things that yes, you can play Nintendo Switch games on it, but you will be much better suited playing this on a wider aspect ratio device compared to the AYANEO Pocket DMG. For example, AYANEO themselves have what they call the Pocket S, which I've reviewed on this channel before. This one has the exact same chipset, but with a 16:9 display. And so the visual experience between the AYANEO Pocket S and the DMG when playing 16:9 content is much better on the Pocket S. Now moving away from emulation, let's talk a little bit about Android gaming and streaming. And I will say that Android games are one of the best and unexpected fits with the AYANEO DMG. It works especially well with single analog stick games that have controller support built in. So something like Stardew Valley or Diablo Immortal are a true joy to play on a handheld like this. In fact, I got such a kick out of playing Diablo on this thing. It's so crazy. It looks like a Game Boy, but it is playing this modern game at the highest settings possible. And so it almost feels like I'm running a cheat code or something, that I can play something so high-end on a device that looks and feels a little bit low-end. And like I mentioned before, playing a game that doesn't have really intensive camera controls like Zenless Zone Zero and even Minecraft, I found these to be playable. I don't think it's quite as good as like using an Xbox controller and having a full right analog stick, but it can definitely get the job done. However, when it comes to playing those twin stick games, something like Call of Duty Warzone, it is just awful. And so this is not something that I would recommend for anybody. And it's kind of a shame because this is one of those things that also is a little bit thrilling. It scales perfectly to the 8:7 aspect ratio on this screen. And so you could definitely play this way. It's just the controls that are holding you back. Now, when it comes to streaming, it's kind of a mixture of both. Number one is that when you stream something more modern, it's going to be 16:9, which does make everything look very small. And then same thing here, you also are going to have all these control issues. So playing something like Doom Eternal on this was just laughably bad. But there are quite a few, indie games or single stick games out there available on like Game Pass and Xbox. And so you could definitely still eke out some gameplay here. It's going to be a little bit small because of that 16:9 versus 8:7, but that really is going to come down to you. Now this device is also capable of video out. You can use a USB-C dock, and it works out pretty well within reason. In this scenario, I'm going to be using the AYANEO multi-dock. They sell this for I think $100 on their website. I reviewed it maybe a year or two ago, and this was very much so plug and play. So I just put it in here, connected it to my monitor, and everything worked out well. Another thing you may not know is that AYANEO has their own 8-bit DO SN30 Pro controller. They sent this one out to me a while back, and it's basically the same as any other 8-bit DO controller, but it's white, and so I think it looks pretty cool. Either way, the setup here is pretty seamless, especially if you're going to use like Emulation Station Desktop Edition as your front end. The only major difference here is that the output of the video is going to be a duplicate of the actual screen, so it's going to be 8:7. So it is not naturally going to scale over to 16:9 on a 16:9 display. There are ways to turn that on if you go into developer options and try to force that in, but I think that just out of the box, this is the experience that you can expect. And when playing games that look fine on 8:7, for example NES or even Game Boy, all this is going to look good. Even playing 4:3 is going to look pretty good, but a little bit compromised because we do have black bars at the top and bottom. Thankfully, those bars are minimal, and so if you don't want to go in and fudge around with the settings, you can still get something pretty good. However, once you start moving into some of the wider systems, this is where the cracks start to show. So for example, with Game Boy Advance, you can see that the image is quite small. This should be blown up quite a bit more. And then of course, playing a 16:9 system on here is going to be pretty funny because it's going to give you huge black borders. So long story short, if you want to get into the weeds here, you can adjust things within the developer options, but out of the box, you're better off just playing things like Game Boy, NES, and Super Nintendo. And finally, last thing before wrapping up, let's talk a little bit about battery life. Now this has a 6,000 milliamp hour battery, which is quite big. So let's go over the 3 scenarios that I tested. The first is a best case scenario. So here is playing Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo and in the saving mode, which is going to be the lowest power mode. And so here I played it for an hour and then checked the battery drain and then did some calculations to see what that would actually give me in a long-term setting. And so even though this is not a perfect test, I didn't go through and actually play it for 16 hours and 40 minutes. That's what the calculation came out to be. And obviously that is a ridiculous amount of gameplay time for Super Nintendo. I think that's crazy. Now moving things up here, let's go into higher end gaming. So here I played Dragon Quest VIII on the PS2 and I played this in the game mode, so the 3rd out of 4 settings. And here I got 5 hours and 35 minutes. So this is still really impressive, especially because we're pushing pretty hard at that point. Most systems will not need game mode at all. It's only really going to be some GameCube, most PS2, and then also Nintendo Switch and Wii U. And getting 5.5 hours in that mode means that you will get much more battery life when you're playing it, with something like Nintendo 64. And then finally, I also ran a worst case scenario. So this is me running Hades on Nintendo Switch in docked mode, and I ran it in max mode. So I'm pushing the fan as well as the performance as far as possible. And here I got 2 hours and 46 minutes. So still a respectable amount of battery life, especially because we're pushing it so far. So long story short, in terms of battery life, I've got no complaints. I think this is an excellent performer, all things considered. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to testing. Let's start wrapping up, talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Pocket DMG, and then move on from there. We'll start with what I like, and number one is the fact that this feels so premium. In fact, I'm just going to pause here and tell a little bit of a story because I think it really exemplifies how this all actually feels. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, I had a friend named Nick, and he had all the cool stuff, all the things that we never had, and he had a Game Boy. He had Metroid 2, he had Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan, and he had Super Mario Land. And I remember he brought them over to our house, and we went over in the backyard. We had like a trampoline, one of those old trampolines that didn't have a net around it. And we used to play on that trampoline all the time. And I remember sitting on the trampoline and playing this game in the middle of a field and thinking to myself that this is the best gaming experience of my entire life. To my young eyes, it looked just as good as the NES and our TV in the house, and it was just amazing to be able to play that on a trampoline, and we could play that on a battery. And so that was one of my most cherished gaming memories, where I remember just thinking that this was a whole new generation and a new level of gameplay that I'd never seen before. And a part of my brain kept coming back to that memory every time I played the AYANEO DMG, because it felt so premium that it reminded me of that same experience where I held it and I thought, this is the next generation. This is how gaming is going to be. And it's ironic because I'm just playing the same old games. It's the same Game Boy games and everything else. But this feeling was one of those things that really captured my heart. And that's not something that happens very often on this channel at all, even though I touch these things all the time. And so when I talk about this thing being a premium experience, that's what I'm talking about. It's a combination of all this stuff. The fact that we have a screen here that works out pretty darn well for most every system you can throw at it. And you've got surprisingly great controls in most aspects. It's not going to be able to play every system perfectly, but the ones it does really knocks it out of the park. I also love the balanced weight of this. It just feels like something that's been tooled really, really well. The AYANEO DMG has been delayed quite a bit. This is a system that they were showing off like almost a year ago and teasing, and the fact that it took about a year to actually come out says to me that they spent a lot of time getting this one right, and I think that they did. This company has really slowed down their releases. If you look at them 2 years ago, almost every month or two they were coming out with a new expensive handheld. Instead, we're getting releases that are fewer and further between, and as a result, I think that these are just a little bit more refined, and I think it's well worth it. I also like the fact that this device stays relatively cool. That's been an issue with other AYANEO devices, especially their Android-based ones, and I think this one is probably the best in terms of cooling in that regard. And like I was just talking about, I think this is a mature design. They took their time getting this one right, and it really shows. Now, of course, this device is not perfect, and so there are some things worth considering. The first is that we have a relatively loud fan. If you're just going to use the preset controls, I think that the fans are a little bit aggressive. You can't go into the settings and modify them with each gaming session that you have, but it is one of those things that I wish you could just flick between the different settings and they all were optimized. I've also found that the trackpad experience is a little bit limited. It'll work out pretty well when you're just talking about rudimentary camera controls, so that'll usually work out pretty well, but once you get to the point of dual stick gameplay, it is just a terrible experience. Thankfully, the device is so good in so many other ways that I don't really feel like I'm missing out on much by not playing those style of games on this device specifically. And it's also a very similar experience when it comes to the screen and playing 16:9 content. Again, I don't think this device is meant to play every single system, but it is worth noting that it is not good in some use cases. And then finally, the software itself is still a little bit unpolished. They've been working on their Android build for years at this point, and it still feels a little bit janky compared to just a simple, clean Android interface. It's one of those things where I can see why they keep adding all these bells and whistles to the whole Aya space experience, but honestly, I feel like they should just cut their losses and just give us a blank, clean experience to tailor ourselves. There's never been a moment where I thought that the tools embedded into the AYANEO software were of an added benefit to me. Instead, they just kind of work against what I'm trying to do within Android. And it also bothers me that we have all these custom buttons on it which are not customizable. So putting this all together, there are definitely some downsides to this device. It's not a perfect experience in every single way, but no handheld is perfect in all those different use cases. This is one that's definitely more focused on retro gaming, but at a more premium level. And I think that price tag is reflective of everything that we're getting here. Yes, it is an expensive handheld. We're looking at realistically somewhere between $350 and $500 to get a pretty well balanced experience with the different colors and RAM and storage options. And that is a lot of money. And if you're looking at price to performance, this is not going to be the winner here. I hate to say it, but at that point, you should probably just buy a Steam Deck. If you're looking to play the most games possible in the most comfortable way, it's probably going to be the Steam Deck. But again, this is a more niche and premium output. And I think in terms of just evoking a nostalgic experience, I think that AYANEO nailed it with this one better than they have with any other device they've ever released. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, I think this is the best thing that AYANEO has made, hands down. There were so many times that I found myself just tickled pink with the idea of being able to play Game Boy or Super Nintendo or even like Diablo Immortal in a way that just felt like I was cheating. To put it another way, it feels like this is a Game Boy for adults. In other words, if you think about the Game Boy and playing it back in the day, you usually will have some sort of fuzzy or hazy memories, and they might be a little bit sugar-coated because, nostalgia will do that to us. And playing an actual Game Boy in 2024 is kind of bad. Like, the screen is bad, the ergonomics aren't good, it's just kind of heavy. But the AYANEO DMG feels like that full wish fulfillment of us when we were 9 or 10 years old playing on the trampoline and playing this thing and the magical qualities of it. It's happening all over again, but with this thing. It's like the AYANEO DMG is a Game Boy that leveled up with us throughout life. Now, whether or not this fits within your budget and use case, that's all going to be up to you, but I hope I've given you enough tools to be able to make that decision. Now, if you're looking for a recommendation of whether or not I think the AYANEO DMG is going to be worth it, it really is going to come down to whether or not you think the budget is worth considering. I have a hard time recommending anything that's like over $200. So when it comes down to it, if you are strapped on budget and you want to play things like a Game Boy, but in this form factor, there are $50, $60 options out there. But there are no other options that are going to give you a premium quality experience like this. This device is 273 grams of pure nostalgia. And if you're looking for that and it's within your budget, then yes, I think it's worth it. Whether or not this is worth getting as an everyday driver to be able to play everything up through a Nintendo Switch, I think that's a different story. This really excels in what it does, but it kind of falls flat in other ways. This is a handheld that has some low points, and those low points are pretty low, but the high points are higher than most other handhelds that I've tried before. So let me know what you think of the AYANEO DMG. This thing is super premium, but it's really hard to say that it's worth this high price tag. So I'm really interested to hear what you think about it. I've enjoyed my past 2 weeks of testing this device, and I think that if you got your hands on one, you would love it. But whether or not you're willing to pay that price to get to it, that's a whole nother story. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.